Oh, yeah. I don't know why. I haven't gone any other time. I have calendars on here. It's for your birthday. I mean, why are they changing it? I don't know. Was she not invited? Sorry.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad you found this secret performing space this evening. I think by the time it's over, you'll be very glad that you did. My name is Tom Hodge. I am the chair of the Russian Department here at Wellesley College, and it's my honor and privilege to introduce tonight's musicians, the Sheffield Chamber Players, who are going to be presenting a concert with commentary of the beautiful fourth string quartet by Boris Letoshchinsky. We have been collaborating with Sheffield Chamber Players for 9 years. This is the 9th time we have had our annual concert on campus, and we have been delighted every single time. Actually, I wanted to thank Katie Sango-Jackson, Nora Catlin, Lila Musa. These are the folks who worked really hard on all the logistics to make sure that the concert tonight could take place. These things don't happen by accident. And I heard a strange rumor that there was another event tonight that might interfere with this one, but given the turnout, that must just be wrong. I don't know. So anyway, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sheffield Chamber Players.
Hello everybody, thank you for the introduction, Tom. It's such a pleasure to be back, and I'm really looking forward to discussion. We usually have a Q&A at the end, and as Tom mentioned, we will introduce the piece. I will talk a little bit about the piece, about the times, and we're so lucky to have this opportunity where we have something like 30 minutes to discuss the piece, which historically, I can say it now, we've been doing it for 9 years, we can say the word historically. Historically, we've been using that to kind of create a double-sided lens. We look at history through music and at music through history. And each time we brought a slightly different chunk of Ukrainian or Russian history to this space, and it was such a delight to explore it. And the chunk of history we bring to today is the history that shaped not just Ukraine, it shaped much of the world in the 20th century and since. Due to time constraints and to disturbing nature of some of the material, some of the topics will be just lanced. There will be no time to explore them in depth. But if you have questions, we can tackle it in the Q&A section. So, to begin, I need to open my iPad, and it's not cooperating. There it is. 22nd of June of 1941 is a date that everybody from my part of the world knows by memory, that is burnished in our consciousness. Songs were written about it, literally. It was memorialized as a date after which nothing was the same again. It's the date when the 150 divisions of Wehrmacht, close to 4 million soldiers crossed the Molotov-Ribbentrop line, creating what is now known as the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was 1,800 miles long, and at the height of the territory it took about 286,000 square miles, making it the greatest theater of war in the history of humanity. It started with bombing of Kyiv, my home city, the city where Letoshchinsky, the composer of this quartet, lived for most of his life. Letoshchinsky and the consortium evacuated, as did Alexander Dovzhenko, the famous cinematographer of Ukrainian state, but shocked by the events. He created a film called Ukrainian Empire, and he also created a sketch that kind of captures the mood. And I'd like to I would like to read you the sketch that, complements the numbers. It's just the very opening of the sketch. Long, long roads stretched from San to Donetsk, and cities and villages and suburbs, and everywhere there was women's unforgettable wail. Ukraine cried, "Oh, my sons, my little sons, my children, to whom are you abandoning me? Look around. Are there other such fields, such wheat, gardens, such a sky in the world?" The fields were burning, the wheats were aflame. Black smoke reached the sky like the fury of the people, like the fury of the warriors to the right and to the left and behind as far as the eye could see. Dogs are howling at night, foretelling misfortune, and unseen birds are flying over us at night, foretelling misfortune, and oxen and cows are bellowing and foretelling misfortune. During this time, Shostakovich wrote some of the most well-known pieces that he has created. He wrote the 7th Symphony, the 8th Symphony, the 2nd Piano Trio, the 3rd String Quartet. All of these masterpieces, all of these distinguished by his recognition of the scale and the tragedy of what was going on. At the same time, Ladoshinsky seemed to have taken a very different tack. He didn't write any symphonies at this time. He wrote a lot of chamber music, and a lot of chamber music that used Ukrainian folk songs and dances as material. And despite him being known as a symphonic composer who was very much a dramatically oriented composer, those pieces tend to be intimate, those pieces tend to shy away from the drama. To understand why he made these choices, we need to zoom out a little bit. And so, maybe a little too late, but I asked a wonderful department to include a quote at the head of today's program. The quote goes, "They carry with themselves the unhealed wounds of the past and unshed tears of the future." This has been written in 1919 by Andrei Nikovsky, who was a Ukrainian journalist and political leader of the time of the brief period when Ukraine was independent for just a few years after the Bolshevik Revolution. He wrote this about a generation of Ukrainian writers and intelligentsia that immediately preceded Ladoshinsky. I would like to read you a more full version of this quote, if I may. So he wrote about Vorony, Karmansky, Chuprinka, and Oles, and other poets who approached the place where 3 roads diverge, but went no further and turned back to Taras Shevchenko, the iconic Ukrainian poet of the 19th century. The quote goes, "He and they carried within themselves the unhealed wounds of the past and the unshed tears of the future. He and they nurtured the flame of Ukrainian revival in their souls. He and they remained in the enchanted circle of modernity, anxiously, awkwardly, and timidly leaping forward with artistry and creativity for themselves." What he is trying to describe is the fragmented field of Ukrainian intelligentsia, of Ukrainian creativity, that struggled with obstacles put in front of them by the Tsarist regime and eventually the Soviet regime. However, with Ladoshinsky, the musical aspect of that changes. We had famous composers in the Ukrainian field before. Not so long ago, we brought you some music by Lysenko, who is considered the forefather of Ukrainian music. However, there was never a straight genealogical line, if you will, of a composer, teacher, and their students created in such a way. There was never a symphonic tradition established the way it was established in Russia. And Ladoshinsky is the one to make it happen for the first time. He is famous not just for his symphonic output, for his chamber music output, but also for creating a school of composition to which the composer we brought to you last time belongs, by the way. Sylvester was Ladoshinsky's student, and if you look at his students and their styles, it really tells something of a teacher when you can see the diversity of the styles that he encouraged and maybe not necessarily shared. He was really able to see and look into his students and discover their own unique selves, mark of a truly genius teacher. Ladoshinsky's character otherwise was also that of a person who makes you want to be around him. He, according to people whose lives he touched, he was a big lover of life. He was chivalrous. He sincerely cared for people who are less fortunate than him, who are around him. He had great love not just for human beings, but for all sorts of creatures. He always had pets around him. He had cats and dogs and even squirrels in his Dutch and in his home. In addition to that, he knew several foreign languages, including French and German. He was a brilliant pianist. He was one of those composers who could memorize the piece upon hearing or just by scanning the score with his eyes. And when he composed, he rarely needed a piano. The second symphony he composed on his Dutch in Wellesley, which did not have that instrument. And before we turn towards this quartet, I would like to pause a little bit of the second symphony. Written in 1936, that piece and its history of writing is kind of telling about a lot of the background of his music. So I think we can glimpse a lot through that. He was commissioned to write the symphony in 1933, but he didn't get around to it until 1935. Why might have something to do with events that were going on at the time, and this is where we get in the zone where I will not dwell on that because we have no time. In Ukrainian history, 1932 and 1933 are the years that are as significant and perhaps as traumatic as the years of the war. It's the time known as Holodomor. Artificial famine created by Stalin that killed up to 6 million people and was used to put the state on its knees. Before that, the policy of Ukrainization embraced the national roots, encouraged to a degree the pursuit of national identity in poetry, in writing, in everywhere in arts. And Stalin made a sharp U-turn in 1929, which culminated in the purges of 1936. And so, during that time perished a generation of Ukrainian poets or Ukrainian writers that became known as the executed Renaissance. Ladoshinsky survives, he perseveres. However, whereas his first exploration in Ukrainian roots of his musical material take place in the 20s, none of it is heard in the symphony. However, the symphony's dramatic nature tells us a lot about what might be going on in his mind. Before I go, let's listen to maybe a few notes from the last movement of the four minutes of this works. All right, so thus begins the final movement of the symphony. Hold on. Technical difficulties. There we go. Never got played. It got axed before it even saw the stage. The musicians of the Soviet State Symphony of the USSR, it was supposed to be premiered in Moscow, put up a revolt. Ladoshinsky wrote to his former mentor, Blier, at the time that at the dress rehearsal there was a so-called discussion of the work, which consisted of the fact that some of the performing orchestra members behaved incredibly arrogantly and declared that this was not music at all, it was nonsense, that it was 100% formalism, etc. It was criticized in the article before it even got premiered, and it was not until well after the war that for the first time the symphony got played. He literally had to shelve it. Well, as the war commences, I think one of the important things to mention about that is not just the reasons it started, but also the reasons the war was handled in quite as well as it was. These reasons have to do with Nazi ideology. And Nazi ideology was perhaps poorly understood at the time. And as a result, the events failed to be prevented as they probably should have been. What drove Nazi ideology is the idea of racial competition. They perceived the Aryan people, which didn't necessarily mean race, but the Aryan people to be above all others. And they had a very sophisticated hierarchy of various races, various countries belonging in various rungs of it. To the Aryan people belong not just Germans, but Swedes and Norwegians, parts of Baltics, and in fact, to various degrees, the British, the French, much of Western Europe. I'm not going to go into the entire system, which I myself don't thoroughly know, but what needs to be said is that at the bottom of the rungs was the Slavic people, and at the very bottom of that, below the Slavic people, were the Jews. The Slavic people were considered Untermensch, subhuman. They were not considered fit at all for education or for much beyond the chattel slavery labor. And Jews were considered to be vermin. They were considered to be actively harming Germans, plotting, creating world conspiracies, and subject to extermination. The German plans for the national greatness, putting Germany above all, involved securing the resources to build a nation. These resources, they saw in the only place they could have realistic access to at the time, because they were blocked by the British Empire that they could not take on. The only place for them to expand was towards the east, and it was the fertile lands of Ukraine and the oil-rich fields of Caucasus that they sought for their concept of Lebensraum, a living space. This living space was to be cleared of everyone living there currently. It was the Stalin's artificial famines that told Hitler that it was possible to starve the population while extracting grain for the rest and for export, while as the people worked on the fields. It was American conquest of the frontier that Hitler literally based his General Plan Ost on. To him, the East was the frontier. That was his land to conquer, his savage natives to subjugate and to eradicate. He admired these events. He admired the slavery that he saw build much of American state. And in 1940, when the General Plan Ost was created in secrecy, the estimations that, the figures that went into this final visage of what that would look like are harrowing even as we know what the war looked like. If they were to succeed, General Plan Ost called for the destruction of all the cities. It called for starvation of some 80 million people. It called for expatriation towards Siberia, everyone else beyond the people absolutely necessary to maintain the farms, people who would not be allowed to be educated past the 4th grade, who would be kept in slave conditions. And of course, the entire Jewish population was to be somehow gotten rid of. At that time, the version of the final solution was not extermination. At that time, the version of the final solution was deportation. the Jews would be deported, initially to Madagascar. But since British didn't cooperate, that didn't work out. They asked Soviet Union if they could take their Jews, that by the time they had millions of due to occupation of Poland. It was not in Germany that most of the Ukrainian Jews lived, it was in Eastern Europe due to various historical factors, due to the failure of settlement of the Russian Empire. It was these countries that contain the vast majority of the Jewish population. These countries that Hitler moved on in 1939 and essentially in 1941. And doing that, he created the empire that had the biggest population of Jews in history. People he wanted to exterminate and didn't know yet how. And as the armies of Wehrmacht moved towards Ukraine in 1941, as they encountered resistance and the invasion almost immediately didn't go according to the plan, the version of the final solution that we currently know came into being, the version of execution. And this is exactly how most of the Holocaust happened in those parts of the land. I think I will concentrate mostly on the history of Kiev, because the entire history of the World War II is way beyond our scope. The encirclement of Kiev happened in September 19th, and the way the war went in the first months of it had a lot to do with the Germans and their ideology, but also with Stalin's position. Stalin's paranoia told him that it was the right thing to order his troops to stand ground no matter what. Instead of retreating, they were ordered to never step a foot back. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled in one battle after the other. And the Battle of Kiev was one of the biggest blows of the entire war to the Soviet army. In the Battle of Kiev, the Germans managed to create a pincer maneuver that encircled some 700,000 Soviet soldiers. 700,000 is about the size of the Russian army currently present in Ukraine, the entirety of it, maybe a little more. As a result, close to 500,000 prisoners of war were taken. And prisoners of war, Soviet prisoners of war, is a lesser known, perhaps, genocide of the World War II because of Nazis' attitudes towards prisoners, towards Slavs, because these were fighters, because they didn't count on taking so many prisoners. The rate of survival of POWs, especially in the first 6 months, was close to 40%. They were made to march ceaselessly until the prisoner war camps. During these marches, if you fall, you're being whipped. If you don't get up, you're shot. People who are wounded are shot. Nobody counted how many people were shot during the marches, only counted upon arrival in the camp. Camps were basically open field enclosures. And out of the 6 million POWs that Germany acquired during the war in total, somewhere between 3 to 3.9 million died. Out of those, 2 million died just in the first months of the war, at the rate of between 3 to 500,000 a month. Preparing for this, I was thoroughly committed to provide specific numbers to you, to provide researched, accurate numbers, and to my great bewilderment, it was not possible. One of the reasons is because at this scale of catastrophe that this war was, sometimes nobody counted. Sometimes when entire villages disappeared, or when prisoners of war died and were buried as this many rocks in the field, it was hard to keep track of how many there were. And this is why you have ranges in hundreds of thousands and in millions. In any case, we need to move on to music. I don't want to gloss over other important events surrounding Kiev and Nazi occupation in Kiev. I think you get the picture. The quartet that Ledushinsky wrote is based entirely on Ukrainian folk songs. You see, during the war, it suddenly became possible to plug back into nationalism. This was one of those times when you could create nationally oriented music, you could create problematic music. There was a relaxation of the attitude that Shostakovich experienced with his Fifth Symphony and the pressure to make it happy at the end. You could make things problematic because of the nature of the war. And Ledushinsky sees enough. He wrote in that time, not just this quartet, he wrote the suite and Ukrainian themes, he wrote the Ukrainian quintet, which got the Stalin Award. And it seems like to him this was harkening back to the 20s, harkening back to the renaissance, of the brief renaissance of Ukrainian nationalism during the early Soviet times. And so, I don't know if that things are going to incorporate well enough, but I'd like to play for you just one of the songs, and we'll show you how he implements this in a quartet. Okay. So, which one should we do? It's a democracy. Well, perhaps one of the more inventive implementations in the second movement, this song called Poi Verbo Verbo. It's all of these songs' texts are mostly lyrical. They're mostly nothing to do with war. They have folk scenes of lovers reunited or separated, and such as this one. So in a original version, and this is sung by a folk ensemble based in Kiev, Ukraine. The song goes like this.
Вербове буде і зросла, що твоє листячко вода знесла, що твоє листячко вода знесла.
Technology is rebelling against me today. The rise of the machines. Reminds me of the Russian joke. The rise of the machines began and quickly stalled at the Kamaz factory. In 5 movements, and it features at least 6 Ukrainian songs that Ledushinsky arranged for string ensemble. Before we play, in the conclusion, I was going to give you some numbers of the outcome of the war, but I think we can forgo that. But I do want to read you a few testimonials of after Kiev was liberated in 1943, after more than 2 years in Nazi occupation. The same Alexander Dovzhenko, who visited Kiev shortly after, wrote, "There is practically no population in Kiev. There are knots of miserable, poverty-stricken people who need help. There are no children, there are no young girls, there are no young boys. There are only elderly women and cripples." At the time, there remained about 186,000 residents, a fifth of the pre-war population. When Khrushchev, accompanied by party leaders, Khrushchev being the secretary of the Party of Ukraine at the time, entered Kiev shortly after liberation, he approached the Opera House in downtown Kiev, which miraculously survived the Soviet attempt to blow it up in 1941 as Soviets retreated. He noticed a screaming man ran in towards him. "I am the only Jew left! I am the only Jew in Kiev who is still alive!" screamed the man. Khrushchev tried to calm him down and asked how he had survived. "I have a Ukrainian wife," came the answer, "and she kept me hidden in the attic. She fed me and took care of me." We're going to play a piece that has a lot of music based on a lot of poetry and song, but we don't have the poetry. And so I thought, to conclude this presentation, I'll read you a poem. The poem is contemporary. The poem is from a Ukrainian poet written in 2016. The poet's name is Serhiy Zhadin. This is what I'll tell you about the green eye of a demon in a colorful sky, about the eye that peeks from behind the stage decorations of a child's dream, about the eye of a weirdo in which fear turns into fervor. Adults who played music, adulthood which was thus defined by the ability to play music. As if a new overtone appears in the voice, the one that's responsible for happiness, as if men were born with this instinct to be a hunter and a singer. Everything began with music, with scars left by singing, heard by yearlings during autumnal weddings. Music, caramel breath of women, tobacco hair of men, who are grimly readying for a knife fight with a demon that showed up to the wedding uninvited. Music beyond the graveyard fence, flowers that grow out of women's pockets, school children who peek into the ovens of death. Most treaded paths to the graveyard and for water. Only most precious gets buried in the earth. Oiled armaments which will ripen with chill fury, parents' porcelain hearts which will echo with the song of a school choir. I will tell you about this, about the wind instruments of trepidation, about the wedding procession which walks into memory like into Jerusalem, to stash underneath the heart the broken psalmic rhythm of rain. Men who dance as if extinguishing the step fire with their shoes. Women who, while dancing, hold on to men as if not letting them leave for war. Eastern Ukraine, end of the second millennium, the world overflows with music and fire. In the dark, echo the calls of flying fish and singing creatures. Since then, almost all who married back then died. Since then, most of yearlings' parents died. Since then, most of heroes died. Unfolds the sky, bitter like Gogol's novels. Resounds the song of people who gather crops. Resounds the music of those who carry rocks out of the field. Resounds uninterrupted.
Questions? Musicians? About the piece, about the performance?
Amazing, thank you so much. And the song of Ukrainian people are saying that feel all these emotions and go through, and it's so beautiful. Thank you so much. I don't know how you do that, guys.
Can I ask how about the folk songs that you mentioned? There's 6 of them embedded in this piece. I wonder how many of them are very familiar. I mean, if you know Ukrainians know these tunes, or are they fairly obscure and from folk song collections? And just in general, I mean, Alex, you talked a little bit about what they were about, kind of, boy meets girl, and people are separated, people come together, etc. But did you, when you look at the choice of the source material, did Eptashinsky choose these particular texts at all for what they were saying, or is it purely the melodies that they had?
It's really hard to tell.
Yeah.
And that's where I wish I had my hands on the book of his letters that was published, and seems to be out of print, and it was his library at Sins in New Jersey. So I didn't have access to his own words about this. The thing about this, the words of the folk songs are that you kind of need to know how to read them. These are often centuries old, and what they meant when they were saying certain things might be symbolic in the way that we can't directly plug into. And so when you read about how the elm tree is standing, the leaves are falling, and they're being carried by the stream, it has significance that I'm afraid might be missed on a lot of us. And perhaps a lot of them are about parting and about meeting again. So maybe that was the kind of image that he was reaching for, and he had some of the people that he left behind in Kiev who in fact secured some of the musical manuscripts in his dacha, because his apartment was taken over by Nazi command. So he had people left there that his thoughts were probably traveling to. But beyond that, I did not detect any kind of political message or any kind of, anything that you could look into, let's say, a work by Shostakovich and go like, oh, this is a revolutionary song, and its meaning is here like that.
And are they familiar songs?
Not to me. That third movement, Leontovich arranged that song in a slightly different version. That's a very beautiful song, but that's how I know it from, not from something that I know really not. I don't know if you recognize any of them.
Yeah, the first tunes look like, I know this, but it looked completely different in the middle or in the end, and it was like, oh my God, what it is? Just you know that we want just to find something which is completely dissimilar, right? But it looks maybe because this is a screen project, or maybe so. Yeah. Just something like that.
Where was Lepeshinsky actually during the occupation of the Germans in Kiev? Where did he go? Did he go east with?
Yeah, he was evacuated, like the entire conservatory in Moscow, and he was teaching in Moscow Conservatory in the 30s as well as Kiev Conservatory. So both conservatories were evacuated. Ahead of German advance, so he did get out, and all of that he was writing in Saratov, in Russia, which was where a lot of the composers ended up. That was not an uncommon story. Shostakovich and Prokofiev both spent a good deal of war. Once Shostakovich got out from Leningrad, not in Saratov, but also in the region that was considered safely removed from the front lines.
And when did you write this particular
This work?
this work?
Yeah, this one was written in 1943, I believe early 1943. So that's right around the time when the war was taking a turn. That was the Stalingrad battle, which is considered to be the battle when the war was finally starting to break for the Soviets. I don't think that he had that inkling yet. It was kind of probably still hard to tell around this time.
I'm sure you know the Prokofiev quartet that he wrote during the same
Kabardine
period.
films?
Yes, and it also seems to have nothing to do with the war, just with and uses a lot of the folk songs from the region that they were living in, I believe. Did Prokofiev and Lepeshinsky know each other very well?
I cannot tell how well they knew each other. I know that Shostakovich admired Lepeshinsky. I'm not going to be able to answer that about Prokofiev. It's an interesting question how people respond to something like this. I don't think it's a very straightforward answer that people are ready to engage head-on with something like that and create art that reflects an occasion like this. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're able to do this indirectly, and sometimes perhaps they are reaching for an escape or for an alternative, for something that seems to be missing in life because of that. It's probably individual. It's probably the answer to this is the multitude of answers to that. But you're right about the Kabardine feeling piece. In his case, he reached for the folk melodies of the region where he was in kind of Kabardine-Balkar region, where he particularly ended up being evacuated. And in some ways, he kind of paid tribute to the people that received him there.
Was this piece performed immediately after it was written? Like, what was the performance history before this?
That's a good question. Actually, I'm blanking out on that. I cannot answer about that. The performance history of Lepeshinsky's works tends to be somewhat like a dotted line. He did get this great commission for the Second Symphony, which, as we discussed, did not get performed. His operas had mixed success, and his Third Symphony, they made him write a happy ending. The symphony he wrote after the war, he had to change the ending, but he never sent that score to Ukraine. It was performed by Mariinsky in Leningrad only on this condition. The dramatic ending he wrote, he had to rewrite.
And are both endings
Do they still
do
exist?
both exist?
Yeah, they still both exist, and it was actually performed with this dramatic this happy ending for a while. I remember when I was studying, we were studying this piece, our teacher was quite upset that people are still playing this butchered version of the piece as she thought it was.
I have one more question for you. That the final movement is amazing. It has so much energy. The preceding movements are so lyrical and warm in so many ways, but then there's this sort of undertone of pain. But how, Allegro scherzando, did you musicians sort of conceive of the emotional argument of that last movement as you played that? Because there is a lot going on there and lots of changes as it gets repeated and you return to the main theme.
Well, I'll take a stab, given that this is not my culture, so we definitely look to Alex and want to make sure that hopefully we approximate it as much as possible. But the composers take great care with the markings that they give us as these little cues and clues. So with any composer, a lot of our work is playing musical detective and taking all these markings and clues in the music and try to make meaning out of them, understand, from these different markings what they're after. So right at the beginning of this, we see Allegro scherzando, but then, he has this raucous pizzicato thing happening in the lower three voices. And then in my part, he marks to only play it on the G string. So that was not my personal choice, that's his request. And then forte marcato assai, so marked. So he gives quite a bit of information, and then the placement of the accents gives you a sense of where the phrase is leading. So it's extremely well composed in that way, where he gives us a lot of information, and it's amazing what just a few well placed markings like that can do to give you an idea of what to do with it. Although we've been back and forth about the length of stroke and exactly how marked to be and how much length, and so we've been trying different things out.
I would just add to that we made one final tweak to the last movement tempo at about 6:32. In no small part, though, because we wanted to get the most impact out of the fastest section at the end, and how to set that up proportionately in establishing the fast material at the very beginning of the last movement, so that the ends of the movement speak to each other well.
And like a twist to all that is that the folk song underneath all that is Ой, піду я до млина до дірявого, чи не найду Василя Кучерявого. It's humorous song, actually. The line goes like, I'm going to go to the windmill full of holes, and she uses a word that should apply to a sock here. And I would find a boy called Vasil who has curly hair, and it goes on and on like that. The lyrics are kind of, they're full of fun, they're full of humor, and again, it's all about like the young people seeking love and having fun with that. So it's interesting that he put it in a setting that is kind of almost dramatized, but certainly energized, as often is done with last movements.
More questions?
I have one that it occurred to me as we were talking. So in our score, it's marked that the piece was published, or at least our edition was published in 1946.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a resurgence of interest in his music after the war? Do you know if did he have a lot of works published at that point?
Well, he was one of the prominent Soviet composers. He of Ukraine, so he managed, despite various waves of repressions and persecutions that Ukrainian intelligentsia experienced, and through the Soviet Union people experienced, he managed to hold on to that position without compromising his style. He managed to find the path and adjust it here and there, because there are a lot of composers who ended up creating something that's called surrealism music, which lost all of its value, essentially, as they were trying to adopt to the party line, and he managed to avoid doing that somehow. So he was published, yes. I mean, like as a
because he occupied the position, by the definition of having the position that he did in the Union of Composers and the Conservatory, you will get published. You will get your works out there. And there was a resurgence of interest in his music certainly after 1991. There were more papers written, research done about him. But 1946 is the date after the war ended, so probably it wasn't, a great time to publish anything until that was through. But he was one of the first ones to be back in Kiev. He was back only 4 days after the liberation. He couldn't wait to go back.
Well, thank you very, very much. Please join me in thanking you.
What house?